You're listening to the Jōrni Podcast. Have you ever wondered why life keeps repeating certain patterns even when you try to change them? Stay tuned for this thought-provoking conversation. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Jōrni Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. In this episode, we explore how the unconscious profoundly shapes much of what unfolds in our lives, often in ways we overlook. Symbols, dreams, and familiar patterns can reveal layers of meaning that reach far deeper than the surface. Marrissa Rhodes is a licensed psychotherapist, advanced psychoanalytic candidate, and psychospiritual consultant and mentor. She guides visionaries, creatives, and leaders to live symbolically in a world that often demands the literal. Through her podcast, Reverence for Rêverie, her private mentorship, mastermind groups, and teachings, Marrissa helps people recognize the deeper patterns and meanings shaping their lives so they can lead with more coherence, creativity, and soul. Here is my interview with Marrissa Rhodes. Hi, Marrissa. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because decoding the unconscious is such a fantastic topic. And I feel like we haven't really taken the time to do an episode on exactly that for our listeners. So I'm really excited you're here to share your wisdom with us today. And welcome to the podcast.
Yes. Oh my goodness, Petra. I'm so happy to be here with you. And I'm really honored that you invited me to join, and I'm really excited about this topic. It's one of my passions, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to sharing that wisdom with everyone.
Yeah, I feel that this is sort of a piece of our healing journeys that often gets lost. We don't talk about it enough. So I really love that you're here to speak about that. And it is my absolute pleasure to have you here today. And of course, we just finished off your summit, which I hope listeners got a chance to watch as well. So yeah, just amazing that you're here. And would you like to start us off with maybe a little bit about yourself and maybe the parts of your journey or your story that you feel connect and relate to what you do today? And also share with our listeners a bit about what it is that you do today so they can get to know you a bit.
Yes, absolutely. I would love to. So my background currently is I'm a therapist, a psychotherapist, and specifically a psychoanalytic therapist. So that is a therapist with training in the deeper unconscious process. And let's see. I would say that I kind of went into therapy in general, becoming a therapist because of my own family background, like kind of from a young age, I was noticing the patterns, kind of decoding what was below the surface of family dynamics and things that way. It was kind of the position I was put in, maybe I would say. And it gave me kind of training ground for what was to come later on in life. And so that led me into therapy where I wanted to kind of understand, of course, my own experiences, my own family dynamics, but I also knew that a lot of people need to understand what's really going on below the surface. And kind of as an aside, I also was an avid reader. I loved, I kind of joke, but it's not really a joke. I'm the kid that would like get in trouble for reading too much all day long. Like I just wanted to isolate in my room and read books all day. And so I think that also really set me up to recognize sort of the deeper undercurrents, the meanings, the sort of patterns among different intersecting concepts or things that way. And so that led me into therapy to becoming a psychoanalytic therapist. And now that is what I do. I have a private practice and it's actually a group practice. So I've got a couple of other therapists that work with me. And then I also mentor leaders. So that's primarily the kind of the population that I work with are people who are already leading others in some form. And I use that loosely, not just like the CEO of a company, but like people who have some level of influence in their life with others. And what I've recognized over time is that a lot of people can become successful by sort of the old paradigms of work really hard, nose to the grindstone kind of work. But then we hit a limit. There's sort of a ceiling that ends up being met. And in order to move past that ceiling, what I have learned is that the inner journey and this ability to start to what I'm calling, symbolic intelligence, to start to understand the deeper meanings, the way that life is kind of speaking to you all the time is how we can actually start to expand and hold more in our life. So hopefully that answers your question. There's, of course, so much more, but that is a part of how I've gotten here and what I'm doing today.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you for sharing that. As I said, I feel like the pieces that you're picking up on in your background and as a psychoanalytic therapist, I feel like that could be so helpful for somebody going through their own journey, their own healing journey, their own mental health journey. And as you're pointing to leaders as well, I feel those are positions that very especially also require us to be in a state of well being, or we very often can't carry those challenges that come with those kind of positions that we're in. So, and I like the idea of the unconscious. I'm a fan of therapy. I was in therapy for a very long time. And one of the things that I always wondered about is does just talking about things actually help us? And I felt to a certain degree it did,
Mhm.
but there was just not that deeper piece of the unconscious involved. So I feel where you're at is this really important piece that really could help people on their healing journeys in a very, very major and profound way. So
Yes.
very curious to hear more about that and also symbolic intelligence. You brought that up and that's a very curious term as well that our listeners might not be familiar with.
Mhm.
So what does that mean in the sense of maybe where you come from as a therapist, but what also does that mean for our listeners who may not be therapists or practitioners? What does that mean in their lives?
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I think it actually ties into everything that you were saying about the ways that traditional talk therapy that most people are familiar with get to one layer, and it is very helpful. And getting into these deeper unconscious places is actually the driver of everything in our life. And I think most of the resistance to even going into that is because it can be a little overwhelming to go, oh my gosh, there's a lot of my life that I don't even know is in operation and I'm not in control of. And what do you mean? And how do I even start to venture into that? So it can feel a little overwhelming or daunting. And yet, if we want real transformation and we want to really be able to hold what life has for us, or even just the desires that we want to bring in, we really have to at some point get into those deeper layers. And so the unconscious speaks in symbols. And when I say symbols, it's also, like metaphor, story. These are the ways that if you go back into our ancestry, the ancient ways that people passed wisdom down was through storytelling, was through noticing like what are the animals that are showing up in our life right now, what the connection to nature and the trees and the land, right? And so we live in a society where that's kind of been severed from our experience. And yet it is so much of how our unconscious mind is speaking to us. So if I were to kind of define symbolic intelligence in a more clear way, it would be our innate ability to perceive and to work with these deeper meanings behind what's actually happening in our lives. And they show up in dreams. That's often where people's mind go is like to dreams, but it's also through myth. It's also what we are paying attention to when we experience art of any kind, singing, songwriting, these kinds of things, but also paintings, sculptures that we engage with. And it's also in our everyday language. So, I don't think that people often pay attention to the ways that our language is actually a symbol. We say a word that is describing something, but also there's limitation to even that. And so when we can sort of expand our language to include other ways of reading the symbols that are showing up in life, my experience is that it's just a richer way to live. And symbols are the bridge between the unconscious mind, which again, by its very definition is unconscious. We aren't aware of it, to our conscious mind. And when we can kind of pay attention to those things, it's like they start to talk to each other, the unconscious and the conscious experience. So we also don't then have to see everything literally. Literalism is one thing that we can engage with the world that way. We should still in many aspects. But for me, it's just about how do we expand our vision a little bit more to listen for or pay attention to what's just right below the surface, what's a little bit in the background that maybe wasn't the first thing to show up in our understanding. And I think then we start to really begin to see the patterns. We start to understand the patterns and the messages and the possibilities and potentials that our life is guiding us towards and guiding our growth.
That's beautifully said. And I do know a lot of people that work with that in their lives, and some take it very literal, but some also find sort of the deeper undercurrents and what's happening in their lives. Or even, some people on their chronic pain journeys explain to me the symbolism of their pain that they were working with. A very, very interesting perspective on that. And there's also a lot of people that tell me, oh, I don't remember what I dreamed of, or nothing exciting's happening in my life. I just get up, put the kids at school, I go to work, I come back, I'm tired, I go to sleep. So how can our listeners maybe tap into a little bit more of that awareness that you are describing? Or how can they foster working with symbolism in their lives if they feel like that is just not something they can access at the moment? What do you recommend on how we start out with that?
Absolutely. Well, you're speaking to something so important, which is the ways that our culture is very, again, I said this a moment ago, is very severed from this way of thinking. And it's very much like getting back in touch with, well, I guess the metaphor that comes to mind, and here I am using a symbol or a metaphor, right, is a workout, right? Like if you haven't used a muscle in a while, it's going to be difficult to start, but you have to put your intentional awareness, right? You go into the gym and you go, I'm going to work on this muscle group. And so you're paying attention more to that muscle group as you lift the weight or something like that. This is very much the same. So I'll give an example of with dreams. I hear that so often as well. Like, well, I don't even dream, or I don't remember my dreams. It's so interesting to speak to your unconscious. Sometimes the only thing we need to do is, literally go through the motions of, okay, so I'm going to keep a journal beside my bed. This is an indication to my unconscious mind that this matters to me now. So I'm going to pay attention to it. And maybe right before you go to bed, you just write on the top of the page, I will remember my dream. And then you set it next to you. And you don't have to remember everything about your dream, but if there's something that you remember, even just like the slightest little fragment, write it down, right? Another thing is it usually goes by the name of synchronicities, right? But if you notice, I'm sure many people have had this experience with the algorithm as it is today, but there have been plenty of times where I've been thinking something in my mind. I know I didn't speak it out loud. I know that I was not talking to anyone about it. And suddenly something shows up on TikTok or Facebook or something, right? And it's that exact experience that I was just thinking about. Keep track of those, because what's happening not only is this your unconscious attuning to something, but we do have a system in our brain called the reticular activating system. And a lot of times people think about that as, like you go to the store, you buy your red truck or something, and suddenly you're seeing all of those red trucks. It's not because everyone else went on the same weekend as you and bought the red truck you bought. It's because they were already there, but now you're noticing it because it's in your reality, right? The same thing happens with our unconscious in the other direction, where we may not be aware that we're starting to process something or that something else is getting worked through in the background of our mind. But if we start to look at what's showing up in our field or our reality, maybe that is, you hear a song on the radio that says a certain line that caught your attention, and then a little bit later you're in a random grocery store and you hear a conversation where people are talking about that very thing, and then you pick up your phone and there it is on TikTok or whatever again, right? That means that there's something about that that is speaking to you and the place that you're at in life right now. So you see, it can kind of, we can work with it with the dream, where we make the intention of, I'm going to remember my dream. And we start to write those symbols out and start to pay attention to what is the meaning? What is the meaning for me? I'll pause here for a moment in case there are any questions about what I've just said. But I do want to go maybe into the symbolism and how it does have unique meaning to every individual. So it's not very prescriptive.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm smiling and nodding as you're telling the story about the red truck because I had this experience when I was in my teenage years still. And I did my driver's license at 16 because in Canada you can do it very young. And then I needed a car. And I found this ad in the paper of a very reasonably priced, slightly used car that would be perfect for a student driver. And it was a purple car. When I got there, it was purple. I'd never seen a purple car before, so this was the first time I saw a purple car. Now, I really, really wanted this car, but I didn't have enough money at the time. So the person selling it agreed to hold the car for me for 2 weeks, and I could figure out if I could pay for it. And exactly what you described happened. My parents were driving me home, and in town, everywhere, I started seeing purple cars. And this was my thought. I'm like, did everybody just go out and buy a purple car all of a sudden? No, this was my first encounter with that symbolism, with that awareness of when that unconscious mind kicks in and actually becomes aware of something. It will start pulling examples from everywhere to bring them to you to either, reinforce or contradict what it is that you are thinking about and that you are working through. So I find this so interesting that you just mentioned that, but it works exactly like that. And tell us a little bit more about sort of that more individual, because obviously the purple car was very individual to me. I don't think anyone else is going to go out and see a bunch of purple cars anywhere. But yeah, tell us a little bit more about how that symbolism is very individual and not prescriptive for people.
Absolutely. Yes. So, whenever people think about dream interpretation, I think there are a lot of people who will go to like, oh, so water means this, and you even have seen those like diaries or not diaries, dictionaries of what every symbol in a dream can mean. And sure, that could be like a starting place, but actually it's so much more nuanced than that. And I'll give you, sort of a simple example would be a cat. Say a cat shows up. Well, for one person, a cat might be very endearing, right? It might be a symbol of love because they have this dear cat that's always been in their life. Or for some, depending on the cat, it could mean some sort of sneakiness, some sort of wisdom. We don't know. For another person who's been attacked by a cat, it might mean something fearful, something that they don't want to be around, right? And so I think when we can recognize that, sure, there can be ways that we look out and go, okay, well, water generally, so for example, I'll use water. Water generally symbolizes something flowy. Usually it's emotional, right? So there are some general, like, cross-cultural references to dream symbols. And we also need to go to the layer deeper of what does this mean for me and for me right now at this particular time in my life? Because the same thing, a few years from now, what water symbolizes in my dream right now and how it shows up might be completely different a few years later. And so having that willingness to be flexible and paying attention to what is the first thing that comes to mind for me when I think of this symbol that I'm seeing. Another way that people work with symbols that I forgot to mention earlier is with art or tarot or oracle decks, right? There can be sort of the mystical, spooky meaning, or people can imagine that they're predictive or something. And some people use them in those forms. For me, though, it is about how do we commune with our unconscious, because something in the card, let's take the tarot deck, there's 70, what is it, 72, 78, I can't remember the exact number of cards in the tarot deck. And every card you could pull a multitude of times, but depending on the day, when you pull the card, your eye is going to be drawn to specific, maybe it's the color of the card, maybe it's a certain symbol, something small a small detail that you haven't ever recognized before. Those are the things that we also want to pay attention to, because it's, again, just like you're talking about with the purple car, our conscious awareness would not be drawn to something if there weren't something in it that we're actually trying to work out. I love how you were talking about the ways that this person that you went to buy the car from said, okay, I'll give you 2 weeks to figure it out, right? Well, that shows how immediate your mind was picking up on, okay, I want that thing. It's in my awareness. Now I've got to figure out, how does it come to me? And even just to start to see more and more purple cars showing up was you can kind of imagine it like your life path being directed more towards the thing that you want. And if we start to listen, and, it does require a bit of getting quieter internally within, this is a part of the practice of it, is if we're constantly inundated with information, we're likely not attempting to find the meaning in it. I think that's, again, what our culture has done really well, is to inundate us with information everywhere. And yet we're starved for the meaning behind it. And so it is about getting quieter. It's more subtle. So you might, again, if you're distracted and feeling scattered in a lot of different directions, it's harder to figure out what are the things that are showing up for me, versus when you are more present. And it starts by taking even a few minutes in a day. It doesn't have to be a really long time, but taking even just a few minutes to get quiet and to go, what's showing up for me? What image or word or feeling feels most alive for me today? It can start as simple as that.
Yeah. And as you're saying that, I feel like there's a component of self-trust that's also part of this, where many of us, I think, along with this cultural separation that happened, there's also a separation from our self-trust or our intuition, if you want to call it that, where very often we don't trust our inner voice or our inner guidance or our unconscious, or however you want to term that. We've been taught not to trust that, because we should be logical, realistic thinkers that assess situations critically and really lay them out logistically in a way that makes sense. And so this inner knowing doesn't really fit into this very corporate kind of thinking. So I feel like there's a component of self-trust that we can work with in that sense as well, to develop that, to help us understand that even if it doesn't fit, like you said, maybe doesn't fit if we dream of a cat, it doesn't fit the description in some kind of dream dictionary, but we trust that inner voice, that knowing that whatever that cat means to us is what that will bring us on our healing journey or our processing or whatever we're working with. So
Yes.
can we develop more of this inner trust, or do you feel like that's sometimes maybe a bit of a stumbling block or a challenge for people to feel comfortable in listening to that inner intuition of their own?
I absolutely do think that that is a common stumbling block. And I think the origins are what we were just talking about, that severing from our culture, or within our culture, of even just our knowing with the land. It directly translated to the knowing within ourselves. And I see that as a very symbolic representation of when we were disconnected from the land to be disconnected then from the body, right? And it is something that can come back online, but it is, again, a practice. A way that this often shows up in my own work with clients is when I start working with someone, I do intentionally ask them not to filter what they're saying. I want them to literally go wherever their mind takes them. And I will even say it like, even if something so random comes in and you're like, why would I even talk about that? It has nothing to do with what we're saying right here. Actually, it does. And I want you to follow it. And I think people at first don't trust me whenever I say that. They're like, what? Okay, I'll try, And then I just notice the places where if there's a pause, if they go quiet for a moment and then they get back onto I will say, hold on a second. What happened right there in that space? Let's actually pay attention to what just came into your mind because it is leading us to something. And I think if we, that's in the therapy room that I'm using that example. But if we think about that in the lifescape, it's not random, the things that we are guided towards. Again, classic example, how many times we've maybe been driving, I'll use that as an example, and we had a sense of, I should get off here, I should exit here. But instead we're like, no, that's going to take longer. I'm not going to do that. I never go that route, only to end up in, traffic or something like that. Or there's an accident ahead of you. And now it's going to take you even longer than it would have if you had just followed that little nudge and gotten off on the exit without actually knowing why. That's the thing about our unconscious mind is it is taking in a multitude of information that we cannot perceive, that we have no awareness is actually even the capacity that our unconscious mind has. And so what feels to our conscious mind like random or, well, that doesn't make any sense. Nothing is showing up to tell me that this is the right answer or this is the right way to go. Actually, we don't know all of the information that has gone into why we're getting that nudge. And so I think if that can even just reframe that a little bit, that those little nudges, those little quiet, subtle movements are actually something for us to trust. And we're only going to learn to trust them by trying them out and then learning, well, did I get that? How did that show up for me? Was that helpful? And of course, I have an orientation to life that also is, there is no such thing as failure and there is no wrong path. I firmly believe that everything we end up doing, if we allow it to speak to us, if we allow it to go, oh, there was a lesson in that for me, then we're still on the path. We're still headed in the so-called right direction.
Yeah, it's so easy to be hard on ourselves for
Yes.
for thinking that, oh, this is not the right way, or this is not how we would traditionally resolve this or go about it. But it happens in many different ways and unique ways for each person to find their path. And so this is one part of how we can experience that. And I am wondering, Marrissa, as a therapist, you help people with a multitude of different situations in their lives. And a lot of them, I imagine, require healing and deep healing, especially after trauma or stress or even physical injuries or anything that may have happened for clients. How does this symbolic intelligence help us on our healing journey? So if we want to process, a high level of stress that we're dealing with every day, or maybe we've had a trauma happen in our lives, or maybe we've had just a very impactful experience or a loss, or we're grieving. How can we use this in our lives to achieve some kind of little bit of I want to say breakthrough or transformation or change in the way that we are working on our healing? How can this support us in that healing journey?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question. And I want to go back to something that you said earlier around chronic pain. It's just an easy example that comes to mind. I've got a couple of different examples that come to mind for me right now. So the first is it was in my own therapy process. I had a therapist, my first therapist, who did a lot of embodiment exercises. And I will never forget. we were combining sort of a sand tray, which is symbolic. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it is where you would pick basically characters or representations of things in your life. And you put it in the tray, and then you start to interpret that symbolically. So, what each of those characters stands for, and kind of why you chose what you chose. And I remember first we had kind of tapped into my own body. I was carrying a lot of tension in my neck and shoulders. It was radiating, kind of pinching at times. And I think that was in one session where we did the more embodiment practice. And then in a different session, we ended up choosing things that were representative of what was going on in my life. And one of them I chose was this figure who was holding up the world, right? And as we engaged with this part of my own healing, there was this recognition of how symbolic it was that my neck and shoulders were hurting. And I had chosen that figure of holding up the world to represent myself, right? It was representative of how much I was carrying, the stress that I was holding, and it was all right up here on my neck and shoulders, on my upper back, right? Where you would imagine your literal muscles holding up the weight of something. So it was such a clear translation. Another example comes to mind of someone I've worked with who struggled a lot with like acid in their stomach. And there's a few different examples of physical ways that this shows up, but this is one. Jaw clenching is another one for her. And as we have worked, slowly getting into what is below the surface and in the deeper depths, there's a lot of anger. And anger was so dangerous to be close to even encounter, that she has swallowed it, right? It's not been able to be digested. And so if you hear even the way that I'm speaking about that, this acid, a heat, something that is what we might even feel a little venomous, right? All the ways that anger or rage can be perceived. And here it is at the core of her, deep down, right? But wants to come up. It keeps wanting to come up. It's burning her throat even, and yet she swallows it back down. She has to keep that down. The clenching in her jaw is very much associated to that, right? This sort of like keeping a mouth shut when more wants to come forward. And so I think you can kind of hear the ways that our body becomes the stage of our unconscious. When, another recent example comes to mind of someone, we were talking about how emotionally unsupported she feels in her life right now. And then she starts to tell me, and I've been having a lot of lower back and hip pain, right? Well, your lower back is your stabilizing force. It is your support for the rest of your spine too, right? So, I mean, I could go on. There's a million different ways that this shows up. But when we start to really listen to not just our body, but then, like I said, when we start to pay attention to the symbols that show up around us, we can actually start to commune with our life for our healing, for the betterment as we go forward. But first we have to let ourselves pay attention to it and kind of want to hear it or listen to it, because that's another side of the unconscious. There are many ways that we try to keep ourselves from knowing what we know, right? We want to put the blinders on and go, oh yeah, that's not me. That's not a problem for me. So it does require a softening to that and going, I actually am tired of this. I want something different. I want to be able to understand what's really going on below the surface.
Yeah. And that self-reflection and a
Yes.
little bit of that self-responsibility, that can be one of the hardest parts to start off on that journey. And I think in that same sense, to give ourselves a lot of compassion and self-love as we embark on these paths, because it can be difficult depending on our lives, especially if we're already in midlife. We've lived through all
Yes.
sorts of traumatic events and losses, and there's a lot, I feel, stowed away in the unconscious. So it can be a challenging start, but the journey itself provides so much transformation and healing that I feel this is a wonderful path to come almost to ourselves, to rediscover ourselves and to rediscover our bodies, which we may have been cut off from for a very long time as we're fighting these battles through traumatic events and even chronic stress and chronic pain do that. And to reunite that, rebuild that mind body connection, and to really give ourselves back that full experience of being alive, which many of us have sort of given up on by this time because it just feels like that's not reachable anymore. So I feel like you're offering, another way to approach that, another path into being alive and being connected to life and everything that means. So thank you for sharing that. And if our listeners are really curious at this point, and maybe they're ready to dip their toes in, and take a look into that unconscious, how can they connect with you, Marrissa? And what kind of programs and services do you offer if our listeners would like to work with you?
Absolutely. Yeah. So first, I would encourage everyone to sign up for my email list. That is where you'll get kind of the pulse of any future offerings. I do occasional soul circles or master classes, as well as other program offerings that I may come up with along the way. So definitely sign up for my email list. I also, when you sign up for the email list, I do at least a once a week. I don't know that I'd call it like a deep dive, but certainly kind of bringing particular topics up to the surface that maybe are on the deeper level, the things that don't always get talked about, whether that's in the therapy room or in the greater society as a whole. I like to kind of center them and bring them forward and just to play with a little bit. So you'll get access to that. I also have my own podcast. It's called Reverence for Rêverie. And you can find that on any of the streaming platforms that you like. So I would encourage you to listen, and kind of a similar thing. I will go into particular areas of interest, and it's very free flowing. So the idea of reverie is very much what I described earlier that I ask my clients to do, which is to say whatever comes to mind and to trust that that has some level of importance. So I really structure my podcast that way. It's whatever floats to the surface is where we go for that month or that week or whatever that looks like. So those are a couple of ways. And as far as working with me individually, I will be opening up a private application for the Living Legacy Mastermind. I'll have more information coming soon for that. So if anyone is interested in working at a deeper level, they are welcome to reach out to me individually. I think you'll have my socials and my podcast and all of my links available in the show notes. So they're welcome to reach out there.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing all those wonderful resources. And yes, we will be linking to all of Marissa's offerings in the show notes as well. So be sure to check there on how you can reach out to her. And Living Legacy, that sounds wonderful. So if this episode really resonated with you, or if you feel that there's some work to be done in order for you to reconnect with your life and your joy and your I want to call it resonance because that was the name of your summit. If you want to reconnect with those things, reach out to Marrissa and, benefit from those resources that she's offering. Listen into her podcast and dive deeper into some of those episodes to get a sense of what's out there for you. And then you can make an application to work with her as well, if that's something that flows from that. So I encourage you to really, really benefit from all these wonderful things she's offering. And Marrissa, thank you so much for being here today and sharing this wisdom with our listeners, with me today. I feel like I've sort of been almost in a therapy session today, and I've benefited from that so immensely. So I'm very, very grateful that you were here today and shared that. Thank you so much for your time today. So much appreciation for you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm happy to share anytime. I've really loved this conversation.
That's wonderful. Me too. And I hope our listeners feel the same way because this is one of these things that I feel we don't talk about a lot because it usually happens behind closed doors in a therapy session or when you are working with someone. So I love the fact that you're shedding light on this, that you're highlighting these immense benefits that people can have by working in this way and then tuning in and becoming aware of the symbolic intelligence. So thank you so much for that, Marrissa, and take really good care of yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Jōrni Podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Jōrni on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejorni.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.